You have seen the pictures of Lake Mead, the white bathtub ring climbing the canyon walls, marking where the water used to be, the boat ramps ending in cracked mud, the sunken boats, and, grimly, the bodies emerging from the shrinking water. Lake Mead has become the single most famous symbol of the global water crisis, and the word that hangs over it is a chilling one: deadpool. The level where the water drops so low that it can no longer flow out through the dam at all. But here is what the endless coverage of Lake Mead usually misses, and it is the whole reason for this video. Lake Mead is not the exception. It is the preview. Because all around the world, on nearly every inhabited continent, in just the last 2 or 3 years, other reservoirs, some of them among the largest and most important on Earth, have been racing toward that exact same threshold. And some of them have not just approached it. They have already crossed it. Reservoirs that supply drinking water to tens of millions of people and electricity to entire nations have hit their version of deadpool, and the consequences have been real and severe, and almost completely absent from the headlines you see. So let's count down 7 of them, from the reservoir sitting right next to Lake Mead, all the way to the single most dramatic case on the planet, a reservoir so large it's hard to imagine it running dry, that did exactly that. But first, we need to be precise about what deadpool actually means, because the term gets thrown around loosely. And the reality is more specific and more interesting. A dam holds back a reservoir, and it releases water through outlets, pipes and intakes set into the structure at various heights. Deadpool is the elevation at which the water surface falls below the lowest of those outlets. At that point, the remaining water is physically trapped behind the dam, unable to flow downstream by gravity. No matter how much anyone needs it. It's not an empty lake. That's a common misconception. There can still be a great deal of water down there. It's just water that can no longer do its job. And there's an even earlier, higher tripwire for the many dams that generate electricity. Minimum power pool, the level below which the water can no longer spin the turbines. And hydropower generation simply stops. For a reservoir that mainly supplies a city, the equivalent is what's often nicknamed day zero, the point where it can no longer deliver water to the taps. Different thresholds, but the same fundamental event. The reservoir crosses a line and stops being able to do the one thing it was built to do. With that understanding, let's begin. Number 7, and we start close to home, because the most important reservoir on this list is the one sitting directly upstream of Lake Mead. Lake Powell. If Lake Mead is the famous patient, Lake Powell is the one in arguably worse condition, and the two are joined at the hip because they are the 2 great reservoirs of the same Colorado River system. Powell is the second largest reservoir in the entire United States, held back by the Glen Canyon Dam. And as of the summer of 2026, it sat at around 3,523 feet of elevation, only about 22% full, and here is the alarming part, that put it just 33 feet above its minimum power pool of 3,490 feet. 33 feet. Below that line, the Glen Canyon Dam, which supplies power to millions of customers across the West, can no longer generate electricity, as its intakes begin to draw air instead of water. Federal water managers warned that without intervention, Powell could fall below that power-generating threshold as soon as August of 2026. Forcing water through emergency outlet works never designed for prolonged use. The true deadpool, the point of no downstream flow at all, sits lower still, at 3,370 feet. So Lake Mead's crisis is not a solo act. Its twin upstream is standing even closer to the edge, and the entire river system that supplies 40 million people depends on both of them staying above these lines. Number 6, and we stay in North America, because there's another giant reservoir on a different river, straddling a different border, in the same desperate state. Amistad Reservoir, on the Rio Grande. Amistad sits directly on the border between the United States and Mexico, formed by a dam completed in 1969 and built jointly by both nations to control floods, generate power, and supply water. And in the summer of 2024, it hit the lowest water level in its entire history. On July 17, 2024, it dropped to hold less than a quarter of its capacity, falling more than 5 feet below its previous record low, which had been set just 2 years earlier. The watersheds that feed it, across West Texas and the Mexican states of Chihuahua and Coahuila, had been baked by severe and extreme drought. Officials warned that further drops would threaten the dam's ability to generate hydropower at all. The Rio Grande, the river that forms the border and sustains agriculture on both sides of it, was quietly running through the same collapse as the Colorado, just with far fewer cameras pointed at it. Number 5. And now we cross fully into Mexico, to a reservoir system whose failure nearly left one of the largest cities on Earth without water. The Cutzamala system, and its centerpiece, the Valle de Bravo Reservoir. The Cutzamala system is a vast network of reservoirs, tunnels, and canals that supplies somewhere between 20 and 25% of the water for the Mexico City metropolitan area, home to around 22 million people. And in 2024, after years of failed rains and a brutal heat wave that accelerated evaporation, it fell to historic lows. By the late spring of 2024, the system as a whole had dropped to around 28% of capacity, and the main Valle de Bravo Reservoir hit roughly 30%, the lowest level ever recorded there. The global press began warning of Day Zero, a specific date, estimated for as early as June, when the system might no longer be able to pump water to the city. On the ground, the crisis was already here for millions. Authorities rationed supply. Some residents received running water for only an hour or less each week. Wealthier residents bought water from private trucks. Poorer ones held out bottles of dark, foul water and waited. Mexico City stood at the very brink of a water catastrophe that would have been almost unimaginable for a city of that size. Number 4. And we travel to Asia, to the case that proves deadpool is not a hypothetical or a future risk, because an entire major city has already lived through it. The reservoirs of Chennai, India, in 2019, the coastal Indian city of Chennai, home to around 10 million people, struck its own Day Zero, and it was not a near miss. All 4 of the city's main reservoirs completely dried out. Bone dry. The city of 10 million was left dependent on a rapidly shrinking groundwater supply and on water trucked in from further and further away. People spent hours of every day and significant portions of their income simply securing enough water to survive. It was one of the starkest demonstrations in modern history of what happens when a major city's reservoirs cross the final line. And it happened not in some distant future, but years ago, to a city larger than most in the developed world. Chennai is the warning that the others on this list are racing toward. The reservoirs do not stop at 20% or 10% out of some natural floor. They can, and do, go all the way to zero. Number 3. And we move to Europe, to a reservoir whose disappearance literally unearthed the past. The Sau Reservoir, in the Catalonia region of northeastern Spain. The Sau Reservoir was created in 1966 by damming the Ter River, and in doing so, it flooded an old village called Santa Rom de Sau, drowning its 11th century church beneath the water. For decades, that church sat submerged, a ghost under the surface. But Catalonia then endured its worst drought on record, 3 consecutive years, from 2022 through 2024, that were collectively the driest since 1914. And by early March of 2024, the Sau Reservoir had fallen to just 1% of its capacity. At a time of year, it would normally sit around 65%. The water receded so far that the medieval village re-emerged. Its ancient church now standing on dry, cracked ground, a 1,000-year-old ruin exhumed by climate change. The regional government declared a drought emergency for 6 million residents. In Barcelona, public fountains and beachside showers were shut off, and residents were limited to a strict daily ration. A reservoir at 1% is, for all practical purposes, a reservoir that has hit its dead pool. Number 2, and we cross to North Africa, to a nation where the water crisis has become a matter of daily national survival. Al Masira Dam in Morocco. Al Masira is Morocco's second largest reservoir, sitting roughly halfway between Casablanca and Marrakesh, and it is a vital supply of both drinking water for major cities and irrigation for the farms around them. After 6 consecutive years of drought, worsened by record heat that accelerates evaporation, satellite analysis showed the reservoir had fallen, by early 2024, to just 1 to 3% of its capacity, holding as little as 3% of the water it contained less than a decade earlier. Much of its bed had become nothing but cracked earth. The impact rippled through the entire country. The amount of farmland being irrigated was cut roughly in half. Authorities ordered the country's famous public bathhouses, the hammams, to close 3 days a week to conserve water, and the king himself convened emergency meetings on the crisis. One geographer studying the region warned that Morocco's freshwater systems were crossing thresholds that the records had simply never seen before. Al Masira is a reservoir that has, in every meaningful sense, already hit the bottom. And number 1, for the most dramatic case on the entire planet, we travel to southern Africa, to a reservoir so enormous that the idea of it running out of water sounds absurd until you learn that it did. Lake Kariba, shared by Zambia and Zimbabwe. Lake Kariba is the largest man-made reservoir on Earth by volume. It sits on the Zambezi River, held back by the Kariba Dam, and its hydropower is the electrical backbone of 2 entire nations. Zambia, in particular, depends on hydropower for the overwhelming majority of its electricity. But Kariba can only generate power using the top 13 meters or so of its water, the band between its minimum operating level and its full level. And in 2024, a savage El Niño-driven drought drained that band almost completely. The lake's usable storage for power generation collapsed, falling to around 8% by late August, then below 5%, and by the end of the year, the reservoir's usable water had dropped below 1%. On September 14, 2024, Zambia was forced to do something it had never done in the entire history of the dam. It shut down its main power station at Kariba, because the country had exhausted its annual water allocation for generation. The result was catastrophic. Zambians endured blackouts of up to 21 hours a day. In some areas, people went 3 or more days without any power at all, and when it returned, it stayed on for only 2 or 3 hours. The largest reservoir on Earth had crossed its operating floor, its version of deadpool, and taken the electricity of 2 nations down with it. And chillingly, this was the second time in just 2 years that low water had forced Kariba's power generation to stop. So step back and look at what we've just seen. In the space of essentially 2 years, reservoirs have hit, or come to the very brink of, their critical thresholds in the American Southwest, on the U.S.-Mexico border, in central Mexico, in India, in Spain, in Morocco, and in southern Africa. 7 reservoirs, on 5 continents, every one of them either at deadpool, at day 0, or a stone's throw away. And that raises the obvious question: why is this happening everywhere, all at once? The answer is a combination of forces that are stacking on top of each other, and it's the same recipe almost everywhere. First, there's the underlying drought, made more frequent and more intense by a warming climate. Second, and critically, there's heat. Because a hotter atmosphere doesn't just bring less rain, it actively pulls more water out of the reservoirs through evaporation. A reservoir can lose enormous volumes to the sky on a string of extreme heat days. Third, many of these reservoirs, from the Colorado to the Zambezi, were designed and their water allocated during wetter historical periods, promising more water than the rivers can now reliably deliver. And fourth, layered on top of all of it, is relentlessly growing demand as populations expand and cities balloon, drawing more from systems that are delivering less. Drought, heat, over-allocation, and growth. That's the machine, and it is running on nearly every continent simultaneously. Now, here is where honesty matters, because this is not a story of certain permanent doom, and you deserve the accurate version, not just the scary one. A reservoir is not a glacier. It can refill. And several of the reservoirs on this very list have partially recovered. When the rains finally returned, Mexico City's Cutzamala system climbed back from 30% up toward the high 50s. Spain's reservoirs refilled substantially after the drought broke. Lake Kariba's levels begin to recover each year when the southern African rainy season arrives. So hitting a critical low is not necessarily a death sentence for a reservoir, a good wet year. Or a few of them can pull it back from the brink. Deadpool is a threshold, not always a destination. But that is precisely why the real signal here is not any single reservoir. It's the pattern. It's the fact that so many of the world's most important reservoirs, on so many different rivers, and so many different countries, all brushed up against catastrophe in the same narrow window of time. Any one of them could be dismissed as a local drought, a run of bad luck. All of them together, in 2 years, is something else. It's a sign that the margin, the comfortable buffer we always assumed these vast structures gave us, has quietly evaporated. These reservoirs were built as our insurance against drought, the savings accounts that would carry us through the dry years. And what the last 2 years have revealed is that the savings accounts are running low, everywhere, at the same time, and that the dry years are no longer the exception they were designed to absorb. So picture the thing all 7 of these places now have in common. A vast concrete dam, built by a confident generation to last for centuries. Standing above a reservoir that is pulled back from its own shoreline, exposing a ring of pale, bare rock or cracked mud, or in one case an 1,100-year-old church that was supposed to stay underwater forever. And somewhere near the base of each of those dams is an outlet, a pipe, an intake, sitting a certain number of feet above the shrinking water. As long as the water stays above that pipe, the reservoir works. The lights stay on, the taps run, the crops get watered. Below it, none of that is true. Lake Mead's ring of white rock made that threshold famous. But the lesson of these 7 reservoirs is that the ring is not unique to one canyon in Nevada. It is appearing on dam walls all over the world. And the only question that really matters now, for all of them, is how many feet of water are left between the surface and the pipe, and whether the rain